Okay, hello students. How are you today? We're going to go over chapter 10, which has to do with the Black Death. And we're going to have a test after we go over chapter 11. I thought I'd give you a break for a couple of weeks. And so it talks about the Black Death, the aristocracy, the feudal type of arrangements that were common in that time. And let me get this up here so I can open it up. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me open it up and we'll go ahead and start. I hope everybody had a good Halloween. Hope you didn't get too sick from all the candy. I know people like to eat a lot of candy at Halloween. I'm a chocolate nut, have to stay away from it. Okay, so we're going to talk about crisis, unrest, and opportunity between 1300 and 1500. And was it disintegrating or was it a crisis? The Black Death had swooped into to Europe from the Crimea. It was carried by a flea. And once the fleas were on rats, and rats were on ships, and it first came ashore in Venice, Italy. And when the rats died, then it spread to humans. And the reason why it was called the Black Death is because it created black pustules underneath the arms and in the crotch area, high fever, something like the flu. And when these pustules popped, they leaked and they started new pustules, okay? There were limits to the medieval economy between 1000 and 1300. Europe's population had tripled because of urbanization and cities began to become larger. There were pressures to produce more. Pressures to produce brought more changes to the land. Forests were cleared, marshes were drained, and pasture land reduced to make room for either cities or more farming. And Europe was barely able to feed itself. Now, if you look at this map right here, it shows the progress of the Black Death. It came in through Italy, made its way throughout all of Europe, wound up killing about 120 million people, decimating populations in 3 years from 1347 to 1350. Excuse me. The limits of the medieval economy, there were climactic changes. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the growing season lengthened, and the 14th century Europe became progressively colder. There was actually a mini ice age that occurred during that time. There was a famine in 1315 in northern Europe. It lasted 7 years, and there was large-scale starvation. Rumor has it that there was actually cannibalism going on because people were actually starving to death. So Europe was primed for some sort of decimation, some sort of biological decimation. The origins of the Black Death had spread from Mongolia and reached Sicily in 1347. It struck European seaports and then moved inland. That's how it traveled. It was on the ships. The rats were on the ships, and then the rats died, and the fleas jumped to humans, and that's where they actually contracted the disease. It reached Scandinavia by 1350, and there were continued appearances of the Black Death for 3 centuries. Now, we have seen it reemerge in the 21st century with immigration coming to this country. A lot of people coming from third world countries, they actually bring the disease with them, but we know how to get rid of it now. The mortality between 1347 and 1350, it killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. By 1450, more than half of Europe's population had been lost. Between 1347 and 1350 is when it was most virulent in Europe. In the European landscape in Germany, 40,000 villages disappeared. These are itty-bitty villages. They maybe had anywhere from 25 to 100 people in them. Reduced the numbers of workers and created changes in agricultural practice. It also caused the cost in labor to go up because very few people were still alive to do the job. They could charge more. Okay? Reactions. People couldn't comprehend the Black Death. People sought isolation, others simply succumbed. Let us eat, drink, and be merry. There was search for scapegoats and attacks on the Jewish communities. And the reason why there were attacks on the Jewish communities was because they were the money lenders. And if people owed them money, then they thought that the Jews were responsible for the Black Death. Also, there were people who used to march through villages that used to beat themselves. They were called the flagellants, not flatulence, but flagellants, who beat themselves, and they were trying to appease the wrath of God by beating themselves with leather whips and bleeding like Jesus had bled before he went on the cross. And most of the clergy remained, in their post. They believed it was part of bad air, and this kind of belief would go on into the early 20th century. They never thought that it was fleas. They thought it was bad air. There were some places that actually claimed, bring out your dead, and they would have carts going through the villages, medieval villages, and people would bring out the dead people, throw them on the cart. And they would either be buried in a pit or they would be burned. What caused the Black Death? The traditional explanation is Yersinia pestis, which is carried by the bite of fleas or infected rats, and it infects the lymphatic system, which is the system underneath the skin. That's why it's called bubonic or pneumonic plague. And what would happen is people would get pneumonia and they would eventually drown in their own fluids. So that's what caused it. The impact on the countryside, agricultural areas, was that harvests rotted and manufacturing ceased and trade was disrupted. Why? Because people were too sick to work, and then you had people who died. So you had people in the field that couldn't work. Basic necessities became scarce, and the price of grain fell, and wages rose. Better diet. Like I said, so many people had died tradesmen had died during the Black Death, that when they went back to work, they could charge a healthy sum because they were the only ones that could do the work that needed to be done. There was a healthier ecological balance between arable, pasture, and woodland. A lot of farmers in Europe turned to sheep and cattle rather than growing things. They were worth a lot more, reduced labor costs and increased profitability, and there were large land holdings. Now, the elite were not immune to the Black Death. So there were a lot of aristocrats that died from the Black Death. It killed rich or poor. It didn't discriminate whatsoever. The great landowners were slower to respond to changing circumstances because of the Black Death, and they demanded unpaid labor from their peasant tenants. Eastern Europe peasants were forced into serfdom. Now, what is serfdom? That means you don't work for anything except the food and the clothes on your back. France, rents declined, but the lords imposed other fees. And in England, serfdom declined and eventually disappeared. Why? Because the serfs all died, and no one else was willing to do that type of work for free. The impact of towns. They were already experiencing a population decline by 1300 anyway, because of famines and other diseases. Overcrowding and poor sanitation. There was no such thing as indoor plumbing, so when people went to the bathroom, they went out into the street or into their backyard, and the waste material was in with the drinking water as well. It was a miserable existence. Situation was made worse by plague, warfare, and local economic crisis. Like I said, there was overcrowding and poor sanitation. Poor sanitation can cause infections anytime. After 1500, 20% of Europe's population lived in urban areas. Why? Because there wasn't anybody in the agricultural areas at the time. Increased specialization of the late medieval economy. More specialized and efficient regional economies emerged. Why? Because they learned valuable lessons from the Black Death. They had to be more efficient. Also, they had to be more hygienic. Even though we would see resurgences of the plague over the next 300 or 400 years. The Hanseatic League was formed in Germany between Lubeck and Bremen, and it controlled long-distance trade in the Baltic and North Seas. Luxury goods and wealth. Genoa, Venice, There were manufacturers flourished in Florence, Venice, and Milan, and Florence would actually become the birthplace of the Renaissance. Now, what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance is a revival of Greek art and literature. There were new business practices in banking and accounting. There were new partnerships to minimize risks. You didn't have just one person investing money. You had a whole bunch of people. And that would eventually, lead to joint stock companies where people bought stock in a company in order to have a say-so over it. But that would give the people in the company, the CEOs or CFOs, the ability to use that capital in order to prosper in the business itself. Double entry bookkeeping, credit and debit, and profit and loss. So now you have a better way of accounting so that you know what you're owed, if you need to send out a bill or something like that, and you know what you have to pay. The Medici banking house of Florence became pretty popular, and the Medicis became pretty influential in Italy at the time. The Jacquerie French peasants rose up against their lords in 1358, and then there was a peasant revolt in 1381 where English peasants, artisans, and town dwellers marched on London, and they demanded an end to serfdom and fixed rents. When you're living in a place where you are working basically just to cultivate the land, keep you and your family alive if you have one, there's no extra money. You can't spend any extra money. It's a shame the student loan people don't understand that. But you have no extra money. In 1378, the Ciompi was a Florentine wool carters seized control of the city. They demanded tax relief, full employment, and political representation. This is where we start to see the people rise. They want more of a say-so in government, they want more of a say-so in economic policy, and they want more of a say-so in foreign policy. The general features of the Ciompi were revolts. There weren't bread riots asking for food, and there was resistance to higher taxes. People always have a resistance to higher taxes. Especially when other people don't work, and those taxes go to those people instead of taking care of what needs to be taken care of in the government. Governments were weakened by factionalism or military defeat. Factionalism means one side against the other. This side thinks that the government should be run one way, and this side thinks that the government should be run another. And there's constant factionalism and constant fighting. There were attacks on corruption, arrogance, and violence of the ruling elites. Reason being is that the ruling elites thought that they could get away with anything. They still do, as a matter of fact. Fundamental cause was not poverty, but growing confidence in village communities and urban workers. Okay, they wanted more. They believed they worked hard. They wanted more. They wanted to be rewarded. So let's reward them by lowering their taxes and giving them full employment. Let's turn to aristocratic life in later Middle Ages. When we talk about aristocrats, we mean knights, dukes, counts, barons, people of that nature. Their landed wealth. The increasing wealth of great noble families in Europe, specifically one of the great families that still has a lot of wealth is the Rothschilds. They made their first appearance during the Middle Ages. They own a lot of things, very, 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 very rich. The plague did not undermine their position whatsoever, because someone else would rise up to take their place. A more complex and uncertain world led to insecurities. Yes, of course. When you have things that are more complex, you're not certain about what the future has to hold. What if another plague hits? What if another famine hits? Invested wealth in non-agricultural enterprises. That's a good idea, especially considering that the Black Death had wiped out a lot of the agricultural workers and a lot of the aristocrats in that particular vein. You got to remember back in this time, students, that land determined wealth. It wasn't how much money you had, it was how much land you had. All right? And sometimes these guys were they're very mean, elitist people, did not like to share their wealth. But if backed up against the wall, they can be made to make concessions. So they invested in non-agricultural ventures. The aristocratic life was service to a king or a great lord. They were legal nobility, the noble style of life. There was family honor, chivalry, courtliness, political influence, and deference. Now, in explaining chivalry, chivalry means respecting your enemies, honoring your enemies, even in combat, being a gentleman if you were a man. We talk about courtly love and courtliness. A lot of times these things, excuse me, a lot of times these things were part of they were part of everyday life for a nobleman. Someone who was a knight, for instance, was very chivalrous. On the field of combat, in front of women, he was very gentlemanly to women. And these people kind of wielded a lot of political influence, but they also had deference to people that weren't in their particular station of class. Living like nobles is almost living like a king. You have large castles. Those castles were built to protect you and your family. So, in the Middle Ages, we see the ruling elites as they are now. Basically, okay? Exclusivity. They had lavish banquets. People could be starving outside of the walls of their castle, but the nobles still had extravagant, lavish banquets. They had extravagant clothing because they could afford it. Castles, tournaments, and pageants. They had tournaments where knights would actually joust with one another on horses, and it would be all in fun. It wouldn't be that serious. And they patronized artists and poets, which means that they supported artists and poets. If they wanted to live a life of just being an artist and a poet, a noble would give them money to live. Kings and princes competed with each other in founding chivalric orders. If you have a coat of arms for your family, this is where it emerges from the Middle Ages. They characterize the nobility as a whole, a king or a prince. Now, does it have to do with someone who is stronger or someone who is more wise? Actually, a combination of both. And when you have, excuse me, sorry, I'm not boring myself. You're not boring me. I just got up early today. Characterize the nobility as a whole. Princely service, important to maintaining noble fortunes. Yes, it was. But it didn't mean you couldn't think that you were above the law. And it was toward what they call the ancient regime, which is the old kings and princes who ruled vast lands and didn't really answer to anyone. The 14th and 15th centuries was a period of almost constant warfare where these kings and princes were fighting each other with their armies of knights against each other for one reason or another. Armies became larger and military technology became deadlier. Oh, excuse me. It's not you. And it isn't this. We see the development of the stirrup. If you know what the stirrup is, when you get on a horse, here's the horse, and you get on a horse, the stirrup are attached to the heels of the rider's boots or shoes, leg wear, and they have little spikes in them, and you kick them on the side of the horse, and it gets the horse to run faster. That actually helped in warfare as well, because they used to carry long spears and spikes into combat, and you could probably be thrown from a horse if you didn't have stirrups while you were jousting. The longbow, the Welsh longbow, was bow and arrow was invented. The catapult actually goes back to ancient times, but it was used. And the trebuchet, which is a siege device, when you're trying to knock down a particular castle, it slings rocks at the walls or whatever you want to put in it. England, France in the 100 Years' War of 1337 to 1453. The causes were English kings held the Duchy of Gascony as vassals of the French king, and English presence in France became intolerable, and English woolen interests were in Flanders. So, in 1066, you remember earlier that William the Conqueror came over from Normandy, which was a French province, and the English kings governed over French provinces, and the French were beginning to dislike this. The succession was a dispute over the French crown. Edward III claims to be the rightful king of France in 1357. Of course, he's an English king, okay? So this is the progress of the 100 Years' War, and you'll see that it was not, you got to understand what these wars were all about. Armies would meet on a battlefield, and they would have swords, and they would have shields, and bows and arrows, and would just go out and hacking each other to pieces, and the last man standing, basically, they would take off arms and legs, and they would be there would be very bloody battles. I mean, you'd very rarely survive these things. But the kings, these were kings that usually went out and fought in front of their troops. Okay, these weren't kings that sat in the back directing them. These were kings that actually went and fought. The phases of the war, I'm not going to hold you responsible for that. I'm going to move. You can read more about it in the book. And let's see. Okay, one of the important people in French history was Joan of Arc. She convinced King Charles in France for her to raise an army. Now, notice I said she. It was a girl, okay? And she fought like a man. Oh, sorry. I know you're doing this while I'm talking to you, so I'm getting back at you. Convinced Charles of France to let her raise an army and fight the English army, brought Charles to Reims in 1430. And because she was a woman, and because she was in man's clothing, a lot of people believed that she was a witch. And that's why she was burned at the stake at Rouen in France. But she's highly regarded. In fact, she is a saint, Saint Joan, by the Catholics. The end of the 100 Years' War revealed the fragility of the bonds between crown and nobility, resulted in a stronger monarchy, new national taxes were imposed, and a standing army. Now, why is that important, a standing army? Because the kings and the princes got tired of calling their noblemen when a war would erupt. There was no standing army to protect anything, so it left the kingdoms open for any type of invasion that would come. At the end of the war in England, changing support for the monarchy, there was an aristocratic rebellion against Henry VI. There was the War of the Roses, that they called the War of the Roses, and that was because the houses of York and Lancaster had different color roses on their coat of arms and their shields. And at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard III was killed. And this was the origins of the houses of Tudor. When we start talking about, allergies too, start talking about Henry VIII, the House of Tudor, and Elizabeth I. And there was an importance of Parliament. Parliament had to be brought into decisions. The king couldn't make decisions. You know, we were in this period, beginning of absolutism, that occurred in Europe at that time. And war strengthened the identity between national identity and the state. So people actually could draw from our army beat the French. So it can be, have some pride in their nation. And nationalism is very important later on in history. It becomes very important. In Germany, there was a continuing dissolution of central power, and I'll tell you why. Prussia, which is what it was known before it was Germany, was divided into 35 separate states. Each one of them had their own army. Each one of them had their own monarch. And we wouldn't see them actually unify until 1870, 1871. Princes divided their territories among their heirs. And in East Germany, nobles subject peasantry to serfdom. It lasted a very long time in Germany. In fact, in Russia, serfdom would last up until the 20th century, until the Russian Revolution. The Habsburgs and Hohenzollern rulers. Now, the Habsburgs would be the rulers of Austria, and later the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, when those two kingdoms merged, and the Hohenzollerns would be the Kaisers, when the First and the Second Reichs began in the 19th century with Wilhelm I and Wilhelm II. So you start to see a foundation of power and monarchy at this point. In Italy, there was an incessant conflict in northern and central Italy. Now, I can tell you this. Northern Italians and southern Italians do not like each other. Northern Italians believe southern Italians and Sicilians are very barbaric and very dirty and very dumb and backward, which is not true. But the Northern Europeans believe that they are superior to other Italians. The Pope moved from Rome to Avignon, the Avignon papacy, trying to make it, excuse me, a new monarchy in France. Venice was ruled by an oligarchy of merchants, the Medicis being those, and Milan was ruled by despots. What is a despot? That's a dictator. All right. So there's strife going all over the place in Europe at this time, before 1500. Florence was ruled as a republic dominated by wealthy families, the Medicis. There was a balance of power diplomacy, and then there was a French invasion of Italy to try and bring Italy under the French umbrella. There was constant warfare at this time, okay? The emergence of Spain. Spain became a power as well. Castile, noble families took advantage of royal weaknesses. There was greater control over the peasantry, and there was greater independence from the crown. So in Spain, we start to see. Then Spain also becomes a home for, excuse me, becomes a home for people that want to explore, that want to go overseas, and the Spanish crown actually supports this, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this. It's already posted up there on Canvas, and I'm going to leave you to your own devices. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'd like to let you know that you're going to have a test after Chapter 11, and we will go ahead and, I'll go ahead and do another lecture and a video. If I find something that I think you should watch, I'll go ahead and put a link in up on Canvas under Files, and I will see you again at Chapter 11. Again, I think the test scores are doing pretty good. A lot of people saw if you saw your midterm grades, they were really good. You also need to do your student evaluations of the curriculum, of me. That's fine. You need to be honest about that. I don't take a lot of things personally unless you start calling me names. But I can't improve unless you actually tell me, okay, or tell the school. So I will see you later. I will see you on Chapter 11 lecture, and just watch this one along with the PowerPoint and read Chapter 10. If you have any questions, please let me know. Bye-bye.